In this episode of CRT this week, we're going to go to two universities. The first is University of Maryland. The second is Yale University, or the Yale School of Law. Here we find two different examples of what's happening, some of it actually positive, in the world of critical social justice on the campuses. Most of it's not, but we're going to cover these two events, dissect them just a little bit, and give you an idea of how we can apply this to our understanding of the movement of critical social justice and critical race theory as it continues to move forward. So at the University of Maryland, we've now arrived at a new point where that ladder of intersectionality of different ethnicities and sexual orientation and ableism and now singleism and all of these different isms that we can put into the intersectional ladder has now moved in the ethnic area to a place where, in order to remove success, we have to remove Asians in the intersectional ladder, in that hierarchy. It's got to be lowered because they excel too much and yet they're not white. So this is a real problem for critical race theory and intersectionality. How do you justify the oppression from one group to another when the other group actually excels? Yes, Asians excel more than whites in schools. Well, what you do is you make exceptions. And that's what the University of Maryland has done. We can see here in this chart, what they've done now is they've come up with a new group for their admission and enrollment statistics. What is that group? Students of color minus Asian. So the Asians are being kicked out of the students of color section because they excel too much. This is similar to what we see, what was happening in New York, what it looks like is going to be a turnaround on this, but where we've taken the tests away from students that are excelling. We've lowered the test scores, or we've removed the tests. We've removed classes for gifted students because of the disparities in ethnic groups, without looking at why those ethnic groups have the disparities. What matters, especially in critical race theory, is the end result data. What are the disparities? There's not a whole lot of critical thinking, clear thinking, as we like to say, that goes in with critical race theory. So if you are able to see this graphic here, you can see that below students of color minus Asian, the next category has been adjusted also, which is white or Asian students. So where you have some of the biggest critical social justice movements going, such as in San Francisco, where they recently just passed a resolution to have a formal apology to the Chinese for previous biases in policy and law, going back to especially the mid-20th century. On the other side of this, you are now excluding them from a benefit for admission and enrollment at the University of Maryland. And of course, we've all heard about the bias, the discrimination that goes against Asians at Harvard University, which, by the way, was upheld in court. Harvard lowers the level of the number of Asians that can be accepted into Harvard University because they're too successful. So where we come out with the Asian hate stuff, you can see where there's going to be this real battle here. How do you, a part of critical race theory, a part of the critical social justice movement has always been partially a hard left movement from certain members in the Asian community. Well, now this is kind of backfiring for them. Asians are being discriminated against in enrollment in universities nationwide. They make more money on average than white individuals in the United States. How does this fit the narrative? It doesn't fit the narrative. So what do you do with them? You move their classification. And this is where you can see it's not even skin color that matters. We're going to get into this in a minute, but it's whiteness. Asians are acting too white. And so if there are actions of whiteness, or they're having more success, or they're doing better on test scores, which it has been coined by the critical social justice movement as being white, then you're going to be moved in with the whites. And this is the great problem with seeing the world through a filter of race. Even your race and your ethnicity don't ultimately matter. What matters is, again, down below it, is oppressor versus victim. Success against non-success. And the end result numbers of equity. Where are the disparities? And if your ethnic group has too much success, then we have to move it over to an area that appears more to be more of a hegemonic group, or an oppressor group. Now, a number of people will say, well, this is why critical race theory isn't going to last long. Critical social justice isn't going to really keep moving forward because it eats upon itself. That's true to a certain degree. But I think that we are barely scratching the surface on where this is going. This comes from the academy, and until things change in the universities, then the culture is continually going to adapt the language, the culture, the policies, the disciplines that we get in academia. With this, are we going to break things down even further in the intersectional ladder? Can Hispanics be more white or less white? Do we break those up as well? More white Hispanics, less white Hispanics? Again, not necessarily even based off of appearance or ethnicity, but your results, your success, what you do. This gets very, very muddy very, very quickly. Now, over at the Yale Law School, a trainer, Erica Hart, was brought in from the diversity, equity, and inclusion business to come in and train students on diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a memo, public memo at Yale University, that said the following, that she had led workshops for YLS, Yale Law Student Class of 2024's orientation, the Afro-American Cultural Center at Yale, the Yale Good Life Center, and the Yale School of Nursing. So this trainer has been brought in quite a bit. Now, we're learning about terms. That's important. This training of diversity, equity, and inclusion was called precisely the Anti-Racism Education Workshop. So again, when I talk about anti-racism, when anyone talks about anti-racism, we need to understand everything that comes along with that. It is not trying to improve things for those who are less privileged of a different race, especially African Americans. It is a training, it is an indoctrination, it is an activation into radical policies. And Ibram Kendi, who is most popular for preaching anti-racism, will not say anything different. It's exactly what he says in his books. She starts off the presentation by saying that she is cisgender passing. That's her different identities within the intersectional ladder. Cisgender passing, she has pretty privilege. She has small fat privilege. She is poly adjacent. She's a survivor of white neighborhoods. And she's always aware of white supremacy. Again, that's what anti-racism will teach you. Race is everywhere. You need to go out and identify it. Viewers of the presentation said that Hart went on to say that slavery is intrinsic to capitalism. This is key, and this is where I get the most pushback, where okay, critical race theory is not Marxist. Critical race theory, it does not have, it's a conspiracy theory to think that critical race theory, anti-racism, is really trying to pull down liberal democracy. That's not true. It's everywhere. It's everywhere in the writings. It's everywhere in the trainings. This is the ultimate goal. I'm telling you, that's where it all leads. And that's why we need to treat this not as a racial issue. Critical race theory is secondarily about race. It is primarily political. And that's how it needs to be attacked. That's how it needs to be discussed. That's how it needs to be debated. She also said that there is a genocide against black people, a genocide, and that biology is a racist pseudoscience created by white people to further their dominance. Now, what she's really talking about is what is very popular today, even in the hard sciences, of saying that there is no biological evidence for race. And what they're doing is they're going and they're talking about certain markers in our DNA and our genes, that there is no large distinguisher between races and that race is simply a social construct. Well, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, obviously, different races have different physical characteristics. That is in our DNA. That's in our genetics. I understand what they're saying when they say that race is a social construct. I think that there is validity to that. But that's also a very easy thing to say when you have adopted a very postmodern outlook on the world, when there is no objective truth. Hard sciences get broken down very, very quickly. And what matters is your lived experience or my lived experience, and those things trump an objective truth. So I'm very leery of whenever people talk about a social construct like that. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying that there isn't some social construct in determining race, especially when you're talking about slavery. But you need to take that with a grain of salt when you hear those things, because that is a very much a postmodern move that is a very big part of critical race theory, to say that everything is a social construct. And that moves us right down the road of no objective truth. She also goes along with what we saw in the Smithsonian Institute and the poster that was put up there talking about whiteness and putting all of these, it was really disgusting actually, and putting all these attributes to what is whiteness. She goes on and says that politeness is whiteness, perfectionism is whiteness. In fact, she calls these white supremacy. And this is very concerning again, as I go right back to saying when you try to attribute these things to a whiteness or a blackness or anything else, then what you end up saying is, okay, if you're trying to be perfect with something, what is the response maybe to that? Well, don't try to be so white. Or the other way around, don't try to be so black. These are problems. These are things that are ultimately going to divide us very quickly. And the crits, the critical race theorists, have done an incredibly good job of conflating principles, good, positive principles, to whiteness, and saying that these things are just a matter, they've been built out of whiteness. They're a social construct. So traditional families is whiteness. Being on time is whiteness. Hard work ethic and meritocracy is whiteness. This is disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. Imagine substituting the term whiteness and putting Jewishness in there. How is that going to sound coming off of your lips? This is a dark and pernicious ideology. In one of her PowerPoints here, she has the following. Any conversation about race or racism has to begin with the creation of whiteness as a basis for it, right? It's labeling. They've got to label. Critical race theory and intersectionality is all about labeling. Before race, before racism, there was white. And then we go down into what I was saying about race as a social construct, as in there is no biological basis for it. This is repeated without critical thinking all the time. We've got a BYU professor that I have recorded that talks about this without a clear understanding of what he's actually saying. It's what is the point of saying this? Why do you say this, and yet at the same time you're trying to agitate the differences in all of the ethnicities and the races? Think about that. Why are you trying to say that there's no biological basis for this, for race, and at the same time trying to highlight as much as possible the differences between different groups and ethnicities? Those are questions that need to be asked, that unfortunately the students are usually not in a position of experience or understanding to put forward to these trainers and these professors. Coming down further here into gender, right? Gender is not binary. It is, in fact, to Erica Hart, a tool of colonization. Yes, all of a sudden, gender is a tool of colonization, as if men and women and humanity has not divided up the sexes in a natural, obvious way since time immemorial. No, it is colonization. It is Western white colonization that has separated the genders between two different sides. And she goes on to attach U.S. Western society to it. This is what this is about. She says, gender continues to be a tool of colonization embedded in all of our major institutions in the U.S./Western society. That's what this is about. So in those two examples, again, I'm trying to lead you to see that these are underlying issues of liberal democracy and Western society. And I would definitely put in there Christianity, though it's not always blatant. These are the underlying issues that critical race theory eventually is going after, or ultimately is going after. Secondary people like trainers will sometimes hold back on those things. Here we see right out that they're equating whiteness to capitalism, right? That's a very common thing, and we're going to hear more and more and more about that as the boldness with this and the strength of this movement and momentum and practice continues to grow. And soon it's going to be, in my mind, and it's not that far down the road, in my mind, it's just going to be all out, all the time, anti-capitalist and anti-liberal democracy, anti-Western society, anti-Christianity. And those will be some of its main tenets. They already are, but they're not always communicated that way by those that are kind of in the secondary level of pushing this propaganda forward. All those that come up with these things, that came up with critical race theory, and those that are the radicals that push this, that everybody here borrows from, they all say it without any hesitance. They don't hide it at all. They call themselves radicals, and radical revolutionaries even, because their revolution is to overthrow liberal democracy. Their revolution is to overthrow Western society, to overthrow Christianity, or to transform it, right? To transform it into liberation theology so that it is a social justice gospel that has a political Messiah and not a Messiah that is one who pays for your sins.